The United States and the Cold War, 1945 to 1953, Chapter 23. As I told you last time, we're going to begin this chapter with the last remnants of the World War II chapter that I didn't finish, such as the concentration camps and the Holocaust and the GI Bill. You may find these next three slides disturbing. They're films of reality. Unless we forget, this must not be allowed to happen again. As our troops opened up some of the concentration camps, the people who lived in the cities or in the towns surrounding the camps said they didn't know what was going on. So General Eisenhower ordered the people from the villages to come out and look to see what they were doing. And they couldn't claim that they didn't know what was going on after they saw the dead bodies. And of course, this is what the men found. This is a barracks of the men. This is stock footage, as I said, of the congressmen viewing the Nazi concentration camp atrocities. It's not too long.
A delegation of American congressmen was invited by General Eisenhower to visit the liberated concentration camp of Buchenwald. They came as the elected representatives of the American people to see for themselves, to see for America, the incontrovertible evidence of Nazi inhumanity. The pitiful living remnants they saw, the dead they saw, were in many cases the artists, the teachers, the scientists, the thinkers, the humanitarians of a Nazi-dominated Europe. They and the people of now freed Europe will not forget. Gardelegen. The night before American troops arrived, SS guards herded the prisoners into a barn, poured gasoline on the floors, and set fire to the building. Those who tried to escape were fired on with machine guns. There remained only charred and riddled corpses, which the SS had no time to remove, which the people of Europe will not forget. Near the captured city of Nuremberg, the SS and Gestapo had hurriedly buried many of their victims in mass graves to keep the bodies from falling into Allied hands. They were not successful. German civilians were forced to dig them up and give them decent burial. This too, the free world will not forget.
As I said, it was short, less than 2 minutes. This one's a little bit longer, and it goes into a little bit more detail.
On April 23, 1945, the American Army liberated the Flossenbürg concentration camp. The Americans first encountered the prisoners a few days' march from Flossenbürg. Nothing could have prepared them for what they were about to see. This camp, on the edge of Bavaria, near the Czechoslovakian border, was chosen so that the inmates could be used as unpaid labor to quarry the granite found in the nearby hills. The initial German concentration camps of Flossenbürg, Buchenwald, Dachau, and others were built near quarries to facilitate the mining of stone, marble, and minerals needed for the Third Reich's building plan. The quarries belonged to the SS-owned and operated German Earth and Stone Works Company, and was operated under the supervision of SS officers. Established in 1938, Flossenbürg was originally used for political prisoners. By World War II, it had become an important forced labor center, housing 30,000 to 40,000 worker prisoners in the main camp and several satellite facilities. Later, as the war dragged on, Flossenbürg also served as a transit site for Jews destined for extermination camps. The camp was surrounded by a high electric barbed wire fence and included a crematorium and disinfecting area. When the American troops arrived at the gates, they discovered about 2,000 extremely ill prisoners and scores of unburied corpses. It is estimated that between April of 1944 and April of 1945, more than 1,500 death sentences were carried out here. To this end, 6 new gallows hooks were installed. In the last months, the rate of daily executions overtook the capacity of the crematorium. As a solution, the SS began stacking the bodies in piles, drenching them with gasoline, and setting them alight. Incarcerated in what was called the bunker, those who had been condemned to death were kept alone in dark rooms, with no food for days until they were executed. Scores of unburied corpses were found inside the compound, along with many shallow graves of executed prisoners. Americans discovered mass graves in the area around Flossenburg, where thousands died from starvation and disease at the hands of Nazi executioners. Photographs, transcripts of interviews, and other evidence of war crimes were collected and forwarded to appropriate military authorities. Allied soldiers and the people of the world were beginning to understand the magnitude of the atrocities committed during the reign of the Third Reich. Arbeit macht frei is a German phrase meaning work brings freedom, or work shall set you free, or work liberates, and literally, work makes free. For the prisoners of Flossenburg, freedom was often found in a shallow grave.
May not sound like a lot when you compare to the millions who were executed at places like Dachau and in the Heavens. Like I say, you could take a whole course, a whole semester's course on the concentration camps and what the Germans called the final solution. I find it very emotional and disturbing to myself to teach it as well as to the students who have to understand it, but I didn't want to end the course on World War II without at least mentioning it. Take a deep breath and say, why did we have to watch that, Mrs. Graves? And take a look at the GI Bill. It's a little bit less nauseating.
Just who gets the benefits of this bill?
Any veteran, male or female, with more than 3 months active service, who hasn't been dishonorably discharged.
Will it help me in finding a job?
No, the bill itself does not. But you do get help elsewhere. It's your draft board that helps you to get your old job back. Or the United States Employment Service will help you find a new one.
But suppose they don't find me a job right away.
If they can't find you a job right away, you'll be given $20 a week up to a limit of 52 weeks. Moreover, if your job brings in less than $23 a week, you'll get a government check to make up the difference between your income and $23.
What's the dope on borrowing money?
Don't get the wrong idea about that loan provision. The government doesn't guarantee that you will get a loan. It just makes it a little easier for you to borrow money for a business, equipment, a farm, a home.
Yeah, now suppose I want to borrow enough to build myself a house.
Making arrangements for this loan will still be your job. As with any loan, before you can borrow, you have to show you have credit. By credit, we mean property you own, or the money you're earning, or the skill and experience behind you. Normally, you would have to back all of this loan yourself. But when you're a veteran, the government will back 50% of your loan, up to a limit of $2,000. In addition, the government pays the interest for 1 year on this part of the loan.
Does the GI Bill of Rights give us any free education?
Every veteran, young or old, can study in any approved school for 1 year. Grammar school or high school, college, trade school, business school. You name it, and if you can meet the requirements, you can have it. The government pays all of your school bills up to $500 a year, and living expenses of $50 a month, or $75 a month if you have dependents. Moreover, if you were under 25 when you went into the service, or if 25 or over, and can show that the war interrupted your education, when you come back, you can have that 1 year that every veteran gets, plus the same length of time you spent in active service. That is up to a total of 4 years of schooling.
So why, you ask yourself,
Those are the main points of your GI Bill of Rights.
you remember the problem we had after World War I in the bonus Army March on Washington in '32? The government, in their infinite wisdom, decided to do something to help the veterans and do it immediately. So now that we have that out of the way, we're going to begin our tour of our country after World War II. In September 16th, 1947, which was the 160th anniversary of our constitutional signing, something called the Freedom Train opened to the public in Philadelphia. The train contained dozens of the most significant historical documents in American history, including the Declaration of Independence and the Gettysburg Address, and it toured the nation. Visitors were asked to affirm American ideals by taking a freedom pledge and signing a freedom scroll. More than 3.5 million visited the train, and even more attended the educational programs and the parades that accompany it. Here is an advertisement for the Freedom Train and a picture of it. Beneath the surface of the train's exhibits lay, shall we say, conflict over the meaning of American freedom. Archivists who proposed the initial list of documents for the train intended to include the Wagner Act, which granted workers the right to organize unions, and President Roosevelt's Four Freedoms speech, which articulated the freedom from want. But the Conservative American Heritage Foundation, to which human administration had given the train, eliminated these documents from the exhibit. The foundation also would not include the 14th and 15th Amendments, which had established equal and civil political rights regardless of race. The train did not mention the unions or any social welfare programs that were going on. And just a few documents that, well, like the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment, spoke to the Black history. We're still a racist nation, folks. The train showed how the Cold War had affected America. And just before the train opened to the public, President Truman declared that the United States would adopt a policy of containing Soviet power across the world, and that any disloyal American would be removed from a government job. Now, government officials soon praised the train for contributing to the fight against communist subversion, and the FBI even reported on those who criticized the exhibit. The Freedom Train's history shows how the Civil War transformed freedom by inundating it with anti-communism advocacy and support for the status quo in American society. In other words, 100% American, red, white, and blue. Just think a minute about what's going on. Because, you know, after World War II, we had enormous industrial capacity. We had the largest Navy and Air Force in the world, and our Army was demobilized. We had the only atomic bomb in the world, and we were the most powerful nation on earth. Now, Roosevelt had wanted to avoid a return to isolationism of the post-World War I era and believed that the U.S. should lead efforts to establish cooperation and democracy and prosperity across the globe. And in doing this, through new institutions such as the World Bank and the United Nations. Now, our leaders believed that American security depended on stability in Europe and Asia, and that our American prosperity required the rebuilding of the economies worldwide. After all, we can't make stuff and sell it to them if they don't have any money to buy it with. Well, the chief obstacle to the American leaders' visions for the post-World War seemed to be the Soviet Union. You know, they had been really militarily victorious in Eastern Europe and Eastern Germany. And their triumph over Germany and its claim to that communism, you know, was going to modernize Russia, it seemed to appeal to colonialized people who desired national independence. And like the United States, the USSR intended to reshape the world in her image. Although Americans knew the Soviet military was way too weak to directly threaten the U.S., we did recognize the fact that Soviet intentions were to dominate Eastern Europe. Now, this wartime alliance between us and the Soviet Union was, well, it was formed only to defeat Hitler, and it was never a really friendly alliance. And clashes between us and the Soviet interests and their values were bound to resurface. The Cold War's first event occurred in the Middle East, where Soviet troops occupied parts of northern Iran with their rich oil fields. Pressured by Britain and the United States, the Soviets did withdraw troops from Iran, but simultaneously installed pro-communist governments in Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, in a move they compared to U.S. domination in Latin America. But to many Americans, Stalin seemed to violate his promise at Yalta for free elections in Poland. And soon thereafter, U.S. diplomat George Kennan, which was the Deputy Undersecretary of State, in a famous long telegram told President Truman and his administration that communist ideology made the Soviet government inherently and permanently aggressive. Only America, he wrote, could prevent the extension of Soviet communist rule in the world. And this was going to be the basis for the policy of containment, in which the United States aimed to check all Soviet attempts to expand its power in the world. Meanwhile, in his speech in Missouri, former Prime Minister Winston Churchill declared that an iron curtain had fallen over Europe, dividing the free West from the communist East. And this reinforced the emerging beliefs that a long-term struggle between the U.S. and the Soviets was at hand. In March of 1947, Truman announced that the United States was now engaged in a global conflict with the Soviet Union. And this new policy was going to be called the Truman Doctrine. Are we going to let America burn into communism tomorrow? Is that what's going to happen? Or are we going to do something about it today? This is the Iron Curtain that former Prime Minister Churchill was talking about. This dark line through here. Everything on this side of it was considered free, and everything over here was considered the East or under Soviet domination. Now, when Truman became FDR's vice president in 1944, he was basically an obscure senator from Missouri and had no foreign policy experience. He hadn't been briefed on what was going on in the war, but as a president, he was faced very quickly with daunting foreign policy challenges. Now, he personally did not trust Stalin, and he believed that the U.S. had to assume world leadership. So he decided to embrace containment when the Britain signaled it could no longer afford military aid to Greece, where a monarchy faced a communist-led revolt, and to Turkey, where the Soviets wanted joint control of the critical straits linking the Black Sea with the Mediterranean. Britain asked the U.S. to step in. They'd always been there to help, but after the war, they didn't have the wherewithal. And though unrest in Greece and Turkey was really only homegrown and incited by corrupt and undemocratic governments, these states were strategically important as doors to Southern Europe and the oil-rich Middle East. So to win Congress's support for containment, Truman had been advised to frighten the American populace, and he repeatedly invoked the nation's responsibility to defend freedom at home and abroad. His rhetoric laid the framework for how Americans were going to view the post-war world. Say that real fast. And it became the guiding spirit of the American foreign policy. Republicans and Democrats, and had support for Truman's policy, initiated a very long period of bipartisan backing for the containment theory. And his speech showed the extent to which the Cold War was an ideological conflict, in which both powers, us and the Soviets, claimed our social system was a model for the other nations, and that we were advancing freedom and social justice while defending our own security. Well, Congress's approval of military aid to Turkey and Greece rescued these governments and did check Soviet power. Truman's speech and policy commitment to the United States, he committed the United States to a permanent responsibility in the world and set a precedent both for the U.S. support of undemocratic anti-communist regimes and for the creation of military alliances against the Soviets. The Truman administration soon established new national security agencies such as the National Security Council and the Central Intelligence Agency, which, by the way, were removed from congressional oversight. Now, potential military action was only one element of this containment. Secretary of State George C. Marshall outlined another in his speech in June of 1947, and he committed the U.S. to spending billions of dollars to finance Europe's economic reconstruction. Because the destruction caused by the war, the food scarcity and inflation, it was rampant in the continent. And this crisis expanded the support for communist parties in France and Italy, which American leaders were afraid might go 100% communist if we weren't careful. This Marshall Plan promoted the idea that capitalism, even after the Great Depression, would flourish, and it defined as a threat to American security not just Soviet military power, but the economic and political instability that nourished communism. The Marshall Plan gave a positive meaning to containment, making freedom more than just anti-communism. It represented a kind of New Deal for Europe that would establish mass industry and mass consumption in order to provide employment and a high standard of living for the Europeans. And in only a few years, production in Europe exceeded pre-war levels. But the plan exacerbated high tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, which refused to support a plan that would consolidate the U.S. influence in Europe. And with 23 other nations, the U.S. simultaneously created something called the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, or GATT, to foster more free trade and create larger markets for American goods and investments. Page from a Dutch pamphlet promoting the Marshall Plan. Without the Marshall Plan, your bread would be bare, and so would your children. A little bit strong, but... Meanwhile, in Japan, General Douglas MacArthur was appointed the man in control of it. I guess you'd say he just administered the U.S. occupation that ended in 1948. With a new democratic constitution and land reform. The new constitution gave women the vote and affirmed that Japan would never again wage war and would only maintain a small military force for self-defense. The U.S. supervised Japan's economic recovery as well. And though the nation considered dissolving the giant industrial corporations that had enabled Japan's aggression, the idea was scrapped when the U.S. policymakers realized and determined that a strong Japanese economy would check communism in Asia. And by the 1950s, Japan's economy was booming. And when I say the occupation ended in 1948, I meant the massive amount of soldiers left. MacArthur was still there with a small detachment of soldiers to keep order like policemen, but the massive amount was not there. The Cold War rapidly intensified, and at the end of World War I, each winning power occupied and administered parts of Germany and its capital Berlin, which, incident, was located far inside the Soviet zone. So not only was Germany divided, but the city of Berlin was divided. In June of 1948, when the U.S., Britain, and France started a process that's going to lead to a new West German government, allied with them, of course, the Soviets responded by blocking all traffic from the American, British, and French zones to the city. We'll show them their thinking. And Western planes began an 11-month airlift of supplies to West Berlin. Stalin did finally lift the blockade, but the two nations, East and West Germany, would take form, each allied with a side in the Cold War, and Berlin would stay permanently divided, at least for a while. West Berlin survived as an isolated city surrounded by communist East Germany, and it would be 1991 when Germany reunified. And this is just, okay. This, it may seem a bit sophomoric, but he explains it really well in language that you won't have any trouble understanding.
From June 23, 1948 until May 12, 1949, just 3 years after the surrender of Germany in World War II, the Soviet Union blockaded all ground traffic into the Allied sectors of occupied Berlin. This is a brief timeline of the Berlin airlift that overcame that blockade. This is the German map as it looks today. It wasn't always that way. At the end of World War II, it is a country lying in ruins and divided into 4 zones occupied by the Allies, the United States, Britain, and France, and the Soviet Union, now Russia. Berlin is located deep within the Soviet sector. It is also subdivided into 4 sectors by the victors. The 3 Allied powers occupy West Berlin, and the Soviets East Berlin. The Allied powers provide the essential supplies of food and fuel to the 2.5 million West Berliners. An informal agreement made shortly after World War II ended allows access from the West to Berlin through Soviet territory via 1 highway, 1 rail line, and a canal. Although a formal agreement signed in Potsdam by the Soviets in 1945 allows access to Berlin via 3 20-mile-wide air corridors, the majority of material from the West is by the land and water routes. It soon becomes apparent that Russia plans to keep Eastern Europe under its domination. In a 1946 speech, Winston Churchill declares that from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. The only break in this iron curtain is the Allied occupation of West Berlin. On May 23, 1948, West Germany is created from the 3 Allied occupied territories, and on June 23rd, the Soviet reaction is to cut power to the city and blockade all road, rail, and water traffic. Knowing that West Berlin has only enough food for 36 days and coal for 45 days, they are sure this will force the West to abandon the city. Refusing to give up the city, the Allies, on June 26, 1948, begin the Berlin airlift with 32 flights of C-47 aircraft flying from West Germany to Tempelhof Airport in the American sector of West Berlin. On July 7th, the first coal shipment arrives at Gatow Airport in the British sector. The American effort is dubbed Operation Victuals, while the British effort is known as Operation Plainfare. Nowhere near the 4,500 tons of daily supplies is being delivered, and additional planes must be added to the airlift. On July 17th, after handing out a few sticks of gum to a group of children at Tempelhof Airport, airlift pilot Gail Halverson promises he will drop more on his next flight into Berlin. They will know it is him when he wiggles his wings. The next day, after rocking his wings, the candy comes down in handkerchief parachutes that he continues to drop on succeeding flights. The idea catches on, and many pilots join in Operation Little Victuals. On August 5th, work begins on a 3rd airport, Tegel, in the French sector. By November 5th, the airport is completed, and after destroying a Soviet radio tower obstructing the flight path, Tegel Airport in the French sector opens. Soon the airlift is delivering sufficient supplies to support the city indefinitely. Aircraft and air crews continue the steady delivery of supplies. The Soviets, realizing the airlift has not failed, lift the blockade at 1 minute after midnight on May 12, 1949, restoring access from West Germany to Berlin. The crisis is over and the Allies have won the day. But the Cold War with the Soviet Union will not be over for many more years to come. This memorial to the Berlin airlift stands in front of Tempelhof Airport. The three arching prongs represent the three official air corridors used by aircraft passing over East German territory on flights between West Berlin and West Germany. A matching monument stands at the other end of the air bridge at the Rhine-Main Air Base in Frankfurt, completing the airlift arch. They are dedicated to the 78 pilots and crew killed in crashes during the airlift.
Now, we know for a fact that during this time period when the airlift was going on, President Truman ordered a fleet of B-52 bombers into England. Now, these bombers were the same type that carried the atomic bomb in Japan. And the rumor was started that each one of them was equipped with an atomic bomb, which isn't true. We didn't have any more atomic bombs. We used what we had. We had three. We built three. One was in a test, and one on Hiroshima and one on Nagasaki. No more had been built. They went to starting doing research on a bigger bomb. But Russia didn't know this. And we've always wondered if that didn't have something to do with the fact that the airlift was ended, because they were afraid that Truman might decide to drop a bomb again. Meanwhile, in 1949, the Soviet Union fire tested an atomic bomb, and that kind of ended our U.S. monopoly on nuclear arms. That same year, the United States, Canada, and 10 other nations in Western Europe created something called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. It's a mutual defense pact in the event of Soviet aggression in Europe. And many Europeans applauded when West Germany actually joined NATO, because they hoped this would prevent any future German aggression and defend against Soviet advances. Well, Russia, in turn, in 1955, formed something called the Warsaw Pact, their own military alliance in Eastern Europe. Meanwhile, also in 1949, Chinese communists led by Mao Zedong won the civil war in that country, giving a very heavy blow to the U.S. containment policy. And where we'd been, recognizing Taiwan and Chiang Kai-shek as the leaders, Chiang Kai-shek was a good man, but he did not have control of his men. And although we sent billions of dollars in aid over there, it didn't get to his troops. It was used on the black market by his subordinates. So it was really easy for Mao Zedong to take over. But the Truman administration was criticized by the Republicans in Congress for having lost China to communism. And we didn't recognize the new People's Republic and prevented it from taking its seat in the United Nations until the 1970s. And continued to defend the exile regime of Chiang Kai-shek and Taiwan as China's legitimate government. In 1950, the National Security Council responded to the growing tensions in Germany, China's new government, and the Soviet atomic bomb with a policy of permanent military armament. This document expressing this new policy is called NSC, National Security Council, number 68. And it depicted the Cold War as a conflict between the idea of freedom and the idea of slavery of the Soviets. And that was going to determine whether the free world survived. Now, NSC 68 spurred monumental increases in military spending. The Cold War turned hot, not in Europe as expected, but in Asia. See, back in 1945, Korea was split into the Soviet and American zones at the end of the war. And these two governments, a communist in North Korea and the anti-communist and undemocratic South Korea, they aligned with America. In June of 1950, North Korean troops invaded the South in an attempt to unify the peninsula under the communist rule, and they nearly conquered all of South Korea. Well, President Truman interpreted the invasion as a Soviet challenge to the U.S. containment policy, and he went to the UN, and it was authorized a military action, and the only reason it got authorized is because at that particular time, Russia was boycotting the UN, so it wasn't there to vote. So American troops led by General Douglas MacArthur launched a campaign that resulted in the U.S. occupation, and I say U.S. even though it was a UN, it was a UN ordered occupation. 98% of the troops were American. So they occupied most of South Korea. But in October of that same year, hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops crossed the border and pushed the UN forces back down the peninsula. And when MacArthur demanded the right to use nuclear weapons to repel the Chinese because they'd never fight back and even invade China, President Truman said, no, no, no. So MacArthur's refusal to recognize the president's civilian control of the army led to his immediate dismissal. And I remember when he came back to the state, how angry my father was. He didn't understand what was going on, and at the time, neither did I. But MacArthur had done so much to win World War II, and all of a sudden, you've got this civilian who'd never been in the military telling him what to do. We thought maybe we ought to go into China. It turned out it was a good decision on the president's part, but the war stalemated. And for 2 years, in 1953, finally an armistice left the pre-war nations intact without any formal peace treaty. And a lot of it you see on this show, MASH, is true. They would sometimes debate over days at this peace conference of where you were going to sit. They were in no hurry to have it end. I have a slide of a photograph of the street battle in Seoul. As you can see, anytime you have a war in a town, the town's getting destroyed regardless of which side you're on. And here's just a picture of Korea, how it's actually been permanently divided, and we still have problems along the 38th parallel here. More than 33,000 Americans, 1 million Korean soldiers, 2 million civilians, and hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops died. The Cold War that had begun in Europe now became global. And events since 1947 suggested that the world had not found peace, as had been hoped for in 1945 when the UN was founded. But instead of one world living in harmony, the world was split between the U.S., which led what became known as the West, which included Japan, or the free world. And the U.S. formed more military alliances in Southeast Asia and the Middle East, effectively surrounding the other side, the Soviet Union and China. In the Soviet Union, Stalin's brutal regime had jailed or murdered millions, and they'd sent even that many over to the Gulag in northern Russia. Its authoritarianism made the Soviet Union seem anti-ethical to free enterprise and democracy. But some Americans argued that approaching the Cold War as a titanic struggle between freedom and slavery was problematic. Even George Kennan, who inspired containment policy, argued that U.S. leaders should avoid ideological decisions and view international crises on a case-by-case basis if they were going to determine if freedom or American interests were in danger. Walter Lippmann condemned turning foreign policy into an ideological crusade that required the U.S. to constantly intervene abroad and violate our own ideals by allying with authoritarian anti-communist governments, many of which faced rebellions sparked by internal domestic problems, not Soviet subversion. Lippmann argued that communists were bound to be a part of the movement for national independence, that the U.S. should self-support. The war also elevated the U.S. awareness about imperialism and decolonization, even as anti-colonial movements used in the Declaration of Independence to make claims for self-government were used. Some liberals and black leaders, they pressed Truman to promote decolonization. And in 1946, the U.S. gave independence to the Philippines, finally got out. But the Cold War saw the U.S. retreat from the pressure that FDR had exerted on Americans and European allies to grant sovereignty to their colonies after World War I. Britain and France wanted to retain their possessions in Africa and Asia. And while geopolitical and economic interests influenced U.S. foreign policy as much as the ideas of freedom, U.S. policymakers used the language of freedom to justify actions that seemed to contradict the word freedom. Even extremely repressive governments were included in the free world as long as they were anti-communist. And one such ally was, of course, South Africa, where an apartheid regime preserved white supremacy and suppressed the black population. And here you have them saying they want rights. They don't want to use Jim Crow even in our country. The Cold War was an ideological conflict in which both sides sought to win support across the world. Freedom was central to mobilizing public opinion, and in the 1950s, freedom was a prominent theme in the academy, the media, and mass culture and government. The Cold War seemed to set the boundaries for understanding freedom depending on which side you were on. Culture and history were mobilized by the Cold War, and historians argue that the American creed of pluralism, tolerance, and equality had always defined our American life, and we neglected the ways in which race and ethnicity had restricted freedom. The federal government began to press Hollywood to make anti-communist films, from which all references of racism were to be removed. And I remember, I didn't know it at the time, but they were even forbidden from releasing a film about, what was the name of it? It's a poem, one of George Washington Irving's poems. The Last of the Mohicans, because it showed racism against the Indians. The CIA and the Defense Department patronized the arts, enlisting actors and dancers and musicians to promote the superiority of American values at home and abroad, and they sponsored magazines and academic conferences. The CIA even funded the controversial abstract expressionist art of painter Jackson Pollock, whose canvases were created by dropping and splashing paint and were said to simply embody cultural freedom. And that was absent in the socialist nations, you see. I personally don't like his paintings, but that's okay. Did I come too far? The Cold War's other master concept was totalitarianism. And this term was first used in World War II to describe the fascist Italy and German as aggressive and the ideological governments that harshly controlled all of civil society and denied the rights and alternate values that might lead to social change. So totalitarianism came to describe the Soviet Union and its allies. This concept helped spread the belief that powerful governments were the greatest threat to freedom. And whatever the Soviet Union supported was automatically deemed antithetical to freedom. The American Medical Association launched the largest public relations campaign in history against Truman's proposal for national health insurance, which the Democrats have been trying to get for hundreds of years, calling it socialized medicine. Soviet hostility to organized religion automatically made Christian worship a bastion of freedom. The Cold War also shaped the idea of human rights. The war's atrocities and the Four Freedoms and the Atlantic Charter sparked calls for a new global order ruled by universal rights for all humanity. The war crime trials of German officials showed that the international community would hold individuals accountable for violations of human rights. In 1948, the United Nations General Assembly adopted something called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it declared that all people shall have basic rights to freedom of speech and religion, should be free from arbitrary government, and should enjoy social and economic entitlements such as housing, education, health care, and an adequate standard of living. Although the document could not be enforced anywhere, its assertion that governments were accountable for the way they treated their citizens became very widely accepted. And debates over this showed the contradictions and tensions in the idea of human rights. How much human rights should be supersede national sovereignty, and who or what should protect the human rights that governments violate? Now, those are questions that are still unsettled. But both the U.S. and the Soviet Union resisted the creation of a mechanism to enforce that policy because they didn't want any interference in domestic and foreign policy from outsiders. Now, American leaders were particularly sensitive about race relations. They feared they might invite UN in action against the U.S., and in the 1950s, the Cold War considerations limited human rights, and both the U.S. and the Soviet used human rights for their own interests. The USSR, which is, of course, Soviet Socialist Russia, claimed to provide its citizens with social and economic rights, while the U.S. criticized the Soviets for violating democratic rights and civil liberties. Only in 1992 did Congress ratify that part from the Charter from the UN that covers civil and political rights. It has not yet ratified the Declaration's economic, social, and cultural rights. Now, after the war, President Truman faced the monumental task of shifting Americans from war to peace. The more than 12 million men still in the military in 1945 wanted to return to their families and their jobs, and demobilization did occur rapidly. While some veterans found civilian life difficult, others used their GI Bill benefits to build and buy homes and start small businesses and go to college. Most veterans went into the labor force, taking jobs from more than 2 million women workers. And the government dismantled wartime agencies that regulated industry and labor and set prices, which sparked immediate inflation. So, backed by the Democratic liberals and the unions, Truman in 1945 tried to provide New Deal policies with a program he called the Fair Deal. Now, this would improve the social safety net and raise living standards. Truman pressed Congress to hike the minimum wage, create a national health system, and increase public housing spending. He also wanted Social Security and educational aid. In the year 1946 was one of labor revolt. The AFL and CIO launched Operation Dixie to bring unions to the South and to end the anti-labor conservatism of the Southern politics. And it sent hundreds of labor organizations into the region's textile mills and steel mills and fields. And with no more overtime pay for war production and skyrocketing inflation caused by the end of price controls, workers' real income had dropped sharply. And workers responded by going on strike to demand wage increases. 5 million of them. 750,000 steelworkers conducted the largest single strike in the U.S. history up to that point. And this strike alarmed President Truman, who became hostile to the unions and won an injunction to force striking coal miners back to work. In the 1946 elections, middle-class voters, scared by labor unrest, voted Republican, and many workers, angry at Truman's policies, stayed at home. The Democrats lost both houses of Congress to the Republicans for the first time since 1920. Operation Dixie catapulted the opposition of Southern employers and white workers' racism, keeping intact the Southern political power in Washington. In 1946, elections kind of secured the continuing domination of the Congress by a coalition of conservative Southern Democrats and a few Republicans. Now, President Truman in his first term had really embraced civil rights for African Americans, departing from Roosevelt's administration's apparent lack of concern. The war against Nazism and its racial theories had raised black militancy and consciousness about the plight of black Americans. Now, many states were establishing fair employment practices and commissions, and cities were passing laws to end discrimination in jobs and public accommodations. A civil rights coalition of labor, religion, and black groups supported these efforts, and by 1952, the NAACP had raised the number of black voters in the South to 20%. And in that year, no lynchings took place, as many law enforcement agencies started to crack down on the practice. And even sports started to disintegrate after the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1947 added black athlete Jackie Robinson to their team. And we have a picture of him here sliding into third base in 1949. In 1947, a commission on civil rights appointed by Truman issued a report called To Secure These Rights, calling on the federal government to end segregation and guarantee equal treatment in housing, employment, education, and criminal justice. The Truman administration called the report an American Charter of Human Freedom and hoped to deflect Cold War criticisms that American racial relations violated democracy and human rights. And although Truman soon presented a comprehensive civil rights program to Congress asking for a federal civil rights commission and anti-lynching and anti-poll tax laws and laws for equal access to jobs and education, Congress rejected it. Because remember, they've got a solid conservative Southern Democratic Congress now. But in the summer of 1948, Truman did desegregate the military, and the military became the first large integrated institution in our history. Truman went on to help construct the most progressive Democratic platform in history for the 1948 elections, which included a very robust civil rights plank. Well, when liberals at the 1948 Democratic Convention passed the civil rights plank, many Southern Democrat delegates walked out. These so-called Dixiecrats soon formed the state's Rights Democratic Party and nominated for President Strom Thurmond, the former governor of our beautiful state. This party's platform called for complete segregation of the races, and though he denied being a racist, he argued that the freedom of states to govern themselves was in peril. Truman also faced his second political insurgency from the left. Left-wing critics of Truman's foreign policy formed the Progressive Party and nominated Henry A. Wallace for president. Now, Wallace proposed expanding the welfare state and denounced segregation more than Truman. Wallace differed most strongly from Truman over the Cold War, and he called for international controls on nuclear weapons and advocated trade with the Soviet Union. Yet when Wallace welcomed the support of socialists and communists, opening the party to communist influence, liberals abandoned his candidacy in droves. Though Wallace threatened Truman on the left and Thurman threatened him on the Democratic South, his primary challenger was a very uncharismatic Republican candidate named Thomas A. Dewey, who looked a little bit like, what was his name? I just drew a complete, like Clark Gable. See what happens when you get old, your mind goes numb. He had a little black mustache and thick back here. Truman campaigned furiously, criticized the Congress for its inaction, and recycled New Deal critiques of Wall Street and warning that Republicans wanted to end Social Security. Now, this election was the last one before television, which transformed electoral politics, minimizing the in-depth debate and presentation of ideology and policy. Now we do more name calling, I think, than anything else. But despite a widely predicted Dewey victory, it was so much. I mean, even the newspapers went ahead and printed up papers stating Dewey wins. Truman woke up the next day to an overwhelming majority in the Electoral College. And for the first time since 1868, blacks decisively influenced the outcome. Thurman did carry 4 southern states, anticipating a later shift of these Democratic voters to the Republican Party. Wallace received fewer votes than Thurman, and an outcome which made criticism of America's Cold War policy even less acceptable. It shows you a map. As you can see, it's predominantly, for the first time, the Democrats are green, and the Republicans are pink. The Cold War had completely transformed our life. Society was permanently militarized. The military-industrial complex forged by World War II persisted and expanded. The U.S. retained a large and active federal government which spent billions on weapons and overseas bases. And national security justified enormous government projects and expenditures, which included aid to higher education and the building of a national highway system. It also made government officials secret and dishonest, leading, for example, to the covering up of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons tests conducted on our U.S. soldiers and civilians. Now, in case you can't see it, I'm going to point it out to you. This is the plume of a nuclear explosion. And there was a lot of tests going on out in Nevada at this point in time. Cold War spending fostered economic growth, yes, and scientific and technological innovation, yes, and it greatly shaped our civilian life, both in medicine and computers and aircraft and many other products. Government research, well, it needs help to expand higher education. The Cold War changed immigration policy to favor refugees from communist countries and increased pressure on American officials to minimize segregation. And the Cold War, like World War I, created a culture which sharply differentiated the loyalty form from the disloyal and eroded our civil liberties. In 1947, Truman created a loyalty review system in which federal employees had to prove their devotion to America without even knowing who was accusing them of disloyalty, and even on what basis. No espionage was revealed, but hundreds lost their jobs or resigned rather than be investigated. In 1947, the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, held hearings about communist influence in Hollywood. Celebrities and famous writers and directors were forced to appear before the committee or face punishment. And though some, like our future President Ronald Reagan, alleged that the entertainment industry was rife with communism, some refused to testify, claiming that the House Un-American Activities Committee violated constitutional protections for free speech and political association. A group called the Hollywood 10 went to jail for contempt of Congress, and Hollywood blacklisted them and hundreds of others who were accused of communist sympathies or who simply refused to identify alleged communists. In other words, do you know anyone who's been to a communist meeting? Were you ever at a communist meeting? You got to realize this is in the late 40s, early 50s. And in the 30s, we were having this depression going on. And in all honesty, if I don't have a job and can't find one, and I'm hungry, and someone comes along and they'll help me, I'm going to listen to them. Whether I join the party or not, I might listen to them. And this is where a lot of people got in trouble. A lot of people got in trouble. In case you don't recognize these two, that's Humphrey Bogart, and that's Lauren Bacall's wife. These are some of the Hollywood people walking to the HUD meetings. Several very high-profile legal cases exacerbated the anti-communist craze, or in other words, our second Red Scare. Wickert Chambers, a Time magazine editor, charged that in the 1930s, a man called Alger Hiss, a State Department official, had given him secret documents to take to Soviet agents. Hess denied the allegations, but he was convicted for perjury and served 5 years in prison. The Truman administration put Communist Party leaders on trial for advocating revolution, and several were imprisoned. And, of course, the most famous one, in 1951, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Working-class Jewish immigrants, communists from New York, were arrested and convicted of conspiring to pass secrets about the atomic bomb to Soviets during World War II. The evidence against them was deemed too secret to be revealed at the time, but later it became clear that there was never any secrets about the bomb given to the Soviets. There was no evidence to support the charges against them. And even though their charges were less serious than spying or treason, the judge said they had helped to cause the Korean War. And they were sentenced to death. You know, there was a lot of publicity and a lot of famous people voting and trying to get it changed. They were executed in 1953. Whether or not Hess or the Rosenbergs were actually guilty, they weren't guilty of espionage. Their trials strengthened our American sense that a massive spy network in the U.S. endangered our nation. Now, this climate of fear allowed an obscure Wisconsin senator to lead an anti-communist crusade. And in 1950, Senator Joseph R. McCarthy delivered a speech in Wheeling, West Virginia. It was to a women's, Republican women's organization group. And he claimed to have a list of 205 communists employed at the State Department. I'm sorry, that's my daughter sending me a text message. The charge was baseless, of course, but he constantly changed the numbers, and he never identified anyone who was actually disloyal. But using his senatorial position to hold hearings and the alleged disloyalty of the Defense Department and other government agencies, this means always, he fought like a boxer. He would just keep swinging, and if he missed, he'd swing against something else, and if he got caught in a lie, he'd tell another lie. And though many Republicans embraced his campaign as a way to damage the Truman administration, he began his attacks on government officials and the military. And after Republican candidate Dwight D. Eisenhower was elected to presidency, he began to alienate Republicans. And by 1954, his allegations of disloyalty to the Army led to televised hearings that exposed his tactics, and he was a bully. He would, like the old expression, are you still beating your wife? There's no way you can answer that one. You would know you're not still beating your wife because you never beat her, but you don't get a chance to say you never. You say, no, I'm not still beating her. So you jump right in and say, so you are still, just on and on. He wouldn't give anybody a chance to defend themselves. He was a bully. And seeing on television and seeing him be a bully, the Republican Senate finally came to their senses and condemned his actions. And he left the Senate and died 3 years later in obscurity. But because of him, we have a new word in our dictionary called McCarthyism, and it refers to the abuse of power in the name of anti-communism. Here we see him at the Army McCarthy hearings, and he's pointing out where all these communists are supposed to be located in. He never named anyone. And although anti-communism was most effective to the national government, the anti-communism provided local governments and gave them life as well. The states began to create committees based on the House Un-Americans Activities Committee to ferret out alleged communists. And state and local authorities required loyalty oaths of teachers and pharmacists and any professional. Private groups like the American Legion and the National Association of Manufacturers also began targeting individuals for their political beliefs. Organizations that had been influenced by communists in the 1930s and 40s became tainted. And those who would not testify about their past and present political opinions or refused to name communists often lost their jobs. Un-American books like the stories of Robin Hood were removed from local libraries. Universities refused to host left-wing speakers and fired teachers who did not take loyalty oaths. And the courts did nothing to halt these violations of civil liberties. And the Supreme Court defended the imprisonment of communists for their beliefs. We were thoroughly convinced there was a communist under every bed. And those Soviet spies actually were in the U.S., they were minuscule. And the Communist Party did not endanger American security at all. And most of those jailed or fired in the McCarthy era were guilty of only holding unpopular beliefs or engaging in unlawful political activity. Anti-communism was a popular mass movement that had its uses. One basis was in ethnic groups with roots in Eastern European countries dominated by the Soviets, like the Polish, and among American Catholics who opposed communist hostility to religion. Government agencies like the Federal Bureau of Investigation, led by cross-dressing J. Edgar Hoover, used anti-communism to increase his power. Anti-communism was also used for purely partisan political purposes. such as McCarthy and other anti-communist leaders that seemed to criticize the legacy of Roosevelt and the New Deal more than Stalin and communism. And many Democrats embraced anti-communism to deflect Republican allegations of disloyalty. The Democrats included many in the left and the Popular Front who had helped organize support of the New Deal policies. Anti-communism made conformity the new definition of loyalty. That bears repeating. Anti-communism made conformity the new definition of loyalty. And any criticism of the status quo now appeared subversive. Businesses used anti-communism against unions. And white supremacists used it against black civil rights workers. And others used it to defend sexual morality and the traditional roles against feminism and homosexuality. Anti-communism, most pervasive from the late 1940s to the early 1960s. It shaped our American politics and culture very powerfully. Republicans invoked communism to stymie Truman's political program. And Truman became alarmed by the excessive of anti-communism rhetoric, and he seemed to retreat from it in politics and in government. In 1950, he vetoed a measure that required a subversive group to register with the government, denied passports to their members, and authorized the president to deport or detain them. But Congress overturned his veto and enacted it anyway. In 1952, a new immigration law passed over Truman's veto, which shot down Truman's proposal for immigration reform and allowed the deportation of communists, even if they were American citizens. In 1954, the federal government's Operation Wetback resulted in the military deportation of about 1 million Mexican Americans alleged to be illegal aliens. Truman only barely expanded the coverage of Social Security, and instead of expanding federal social welfare, private welfare is going to prevail. Union workers' contracts provided them with health insurance and wage increases and follow the cost of living with pensions and paid vacations, while all other workers remained covered, but only workers in the unionized heavy industries enjoy these benefits. In Europe, all workers receive these benefits from the government. That's why you had such a high tax rate. All political and social groups had to comply with anti-communism or be destroyed, and this severely damaged the labor and civil rights movement that had benefited from dedicated communist organizers. And after the 1947 passage of the Taft-Hartley Act, which withdrew bargaining rights and legal protection from unions whose leaders refused to swear that they weren't communists, the CIO expelled the left-wing unions with nearly 1 million members. Unions began to support the Cold War U.S. foreign policies. And since left-wingers were often the most militant advocate of women's rights and civil rights, their expulsion left the unions unable to respond to the civil rights movement and an economy that shifted from manufacturing to service work. The civil rights movement changed too, and while major civil rights groups at first protested Truman's loyalty programs and criticized the anti-communists for defining racism as un-American, nearly all black leaders and civil rights organizations were pressured into joining the anti-communist crusade. Groups like the Southern Conference for Human Welfare that had united communists and non-communists in a struggle for both racial equality and social justice disintegrated. Even only legalistic groups like the NAACP. Black organizations adopted Cold War language to argue that segregation and racism in the U.S. gave credence to Soviet criticism of America, and thus helped solidify the Cold War understanding of freedom. So in a climate of anti-communism and McCarthyism, criticisms of American policy, domestic or foreign, invited a very harsh response. Truman's civil rights program faltered, but the booming economy of the 50s, which produced a very affluent society in America for the first time, produced a widening gap between white affluence and black poverty and disenfranchisement that would help inspire a civil rights resurgence in the 1960s. And here we've got gonna put the fire in the Statue of Liberty's torch out. And so we've covered the beginnings of the Cold War, the beginnings because it's going to still go on. The Second Red Scare, and in the next chapter, 24, An Affluent Society, 1953 and 1960, we're going to have some fun times and not be quite so serious. I mean, this has been all about politics and policy, and bad things are going on, but things are going to change here very shortly. Thank you for listening, and I'm sorry for the interruptions of my dog and my daughter.